12 German fighters clawed upward through broken clouds, their engines straining as they climbed into the cold sky above central Germany. Inside their cockpits, radio chatter crackled with confusion. The American fighter they had been chasing was no longer there. He hadn't turned. He hadn't dived. He had simply vanished. Somewhere ahead of them, beyond the gray wall of clouds, a single P-51 Mustang was still flying fast and straight, its Merlin engine roaring at full power. The German pilots searched the sky for the familiar shape, expecting to see the American banking into a defensive turn or diving for escape. But he did neither. The farm boy from Iowa had done something no one expected. He had simply outrun them. And in doing so, he had exposed a weakness in Luftwaffe tactics that no one had fully recognized before. March 1944. The sky above Germany had become one of the most dangerous battlefields on Earth. Every clear morning, the bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force lifted off from airfields across England. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators assembled into massive formations that climbed slowly toward the continent. From the ground, the bomber streams looked like floating cities of aluminum and vapor trails. At altitude, the air was brutally cold. Temperatures dropped far below freezing as the bombers leveled off around 25,000 to 30,000 feet, their contrails carving long white lines across the sky. Below them lay the German countryside, fields, rivers, factories, and cities waiting to be bombed. Above them waited something else. German fighters were already climbing. The Luftwaffe had perfected the art of interception. Radar stations tracked the incoming bomber streams, and fighter units scrambled to meet them long before they reached their targets. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s clawed upward through the sky, forming attack groups designed to smash into the American formations. The doctrine was brutal but simple. Bombers flew straight. Fighters escorted them. And when the enemy arrived, the escorts turned to fight. For years this had been the rhythm of the air war. But the numbers were unforgiving. Every bombing mission cost aircraft. Bombers fell, and so did fighters. American pilots tangled with German interceptors in violent, twisting dogfights that stretched for miles across the sky. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings rolled and dived through clouds of contrails and gunfire. German pilots attacked from above, fired, and disappeared back into the sun. Some American pilots returned to England with stories of incredible victories. Others never returned at all. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed one crucial part of the equation: range. Unlike earlier American fighters, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. With drop tanks mounted under its wings and the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine under its nose, the P-51 could fly farther than any other Allied fighter. It was fast. It climbed well. And at high altitude it was deadly. But there was a problem. Most American fighter pilots still thought like traditional dogfighters. They had been trained to turn into combat, to chase their enemy, to engage in close aerial duels where skill and aggression decided the outcome. The habits of earlier air wars, in North Africa, in the Pacific, still shaped the way they fought. The Mustang had given them speed and range. But their tactics had not yet caught up with the aircraft. Dogfights were still the default answer to every encounter. No one had yet asked the simplest possible question. What if you didn't fight at all? What if, instead of turning into the enemy, you simply pushed the throttle forward and flew away faster than they could follow? To many pilots, the idea sounded absurd. Cowardly, even. Air combat was supposed to be a contest of courage and maneuver. Turning away from a fight felt like admitting defeat. But the truth had nothing to do with courage. It had to do with physics. And one young pilot from the American Midwest was about to prove it. His name was Second Lieutenant Robert W. Bowles. He grew up in Iowa, where the land stretches flat to the horizon and the wind rarely stops blowing. His family worked a small farm outside a town that barely appeared on maps. Cornfields surrounded the house in every direction, broken only by dirt roads and windmills. Life on the farm taught him two things early. Machines mattered. And if something broke, you fixed it yourself. Robert learned to repair engines before he was old enough to drive. Tractors, harvesters, irrigation pumps, anything with moving parts fascinated him. He wasn't the loudest kid in school or the fastest athlete, but he paid attention. He noticed patterns. The sound of an engine before it failed. The way metal vibrated when something was out of alignment. The subtle difference between a machine running smoothly and one about to break. Those habits followed him everywhere. When the war came, he enlisted like thousands of other young men from rural America. There was no dramatic speech or patriotic declaration. Everyone was going, so he went. Flight training took him to Texas. The airfields there were dusty, hot, and endless. Student pilots repeated the same maneuvers over and over until muscle memory replaced fear. Takeoffs, landings, instrument flying, emergency procedures. Some pilots took naturally to flying. Bowles approached it differently. He treated the airplane like a machine that needed to be understood. He studied manuals late at night, memorizing engine limits and fuel flow charts. He asked instructors questions about aerodynamics and performance curves. While other pilots focused on stick and rudder instincts, Bowles thought about energy, speed, altitude, momentum. He wasn't trying to be the most aggressive pilot in the sky. He was trying to understand how the airplane actually worked. By early 1944, he arrived in England assigned to the 357th Fighter Group, flying the P-51 Mustang. Their base sat near the village of Leiston in Suffolk, a muddy wartime airfield carved out of farmland. The English winter had turned the ground into a cold swamp of rain and oil. Merlin engines roared through the fog at all hours of the day and night. Pilots lived in wooden huts. Briefings began before sunrise. Coffee was bitter and food was rationed. But there was one comfort. Every pilot on the base knew the same thing. They were flying the best long-range fighter in the world. Bowles didn't stand out among them. He wasn't an ace. He didn't decorate his Mustang with elaborate nose art. He didn't brag in the officer's mess. He was simply a dependable wingman, the kind of pilot who stayed in formation and followed orders. But while others focused on combat glory, he watched the fights differently. Every mission told him the same story. American fighters dove after German interceptors, pulling into tight turns and violent spirals. German pilots responded with their own maneuvers, dragging the Americans into twisting engagements that consumed fuel and altitude. Often the result was chaos. Pilots became separated. Formations scattered. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty. And sometimes, good pilots died chasing enemies they never needed to chase. Each time Bowles returned from a mission, the same thought lingered in his mind. The P-51 Mustang was faster than almost any German fighter in level flight. Not in a dive, not in a climb, but straight and level, with the throttle wide open. The Mustang could outrun most of the Luftwaffe's interceptors. So why? He wondered. Did they keep turning to fight? No one around him seemed to ask the same question. The official doctrine of the 8th Air Force still emphasized aggressive engagement. Escort fighters were expected to protect bombers by attacking enemy fighters directly. When German interceptors appeared, American pilots were cleared to break formation and engage. In theory, destroying the interceptors protected the bombers. In practice, it created a dangerous pattern. When American fighters chased German aircraft downward, they lost altitude and energy. German pilots understood this perfectly. Sometimes they deliberately acted as bait, drawing the escorts away from the bomber formations. Then, while American fighters were tangled in turning fights miles away, the real attack group would strike the bombers from another direction. The result was a sky filled with scattered dogfights and burning fuel. And every mission seemed to follow the same script. Except one day, Robert Bowles decided to try something different. Even with the extraordinary range of the P-51 Mustang, fuel was always the invisible enemy. Every escort mission began with the same calculation. Pilots knew exactly how much fuel they carried and how much distance it had to cover. The round trip from England to Germany and back pushed the Mustang close to its limits, even with drop tanks. And once the external tanks were empty, the margin for error disappeared. A dogfight could drain a fighter's internal fuel supply in minutes. Hard turns, sudden climbs, and full throttle burned gasoline at terrifying speed. The more violent the maneuvering, the faster the tanks emptied. If a pilot ran low on fuel over Germany, the choices were grim. Bail out and become a prisoner of war, or attempt to glide back across the channel and hope to reach friendly territory before the engine died. Survival rates for American airmen were slowly improving in 1944, but the cost remained steep. Every mission still ended with empty chairs in the briefing room. Fighter Command knew this. Group commanders knew it. But doctrine rarely changes until someone proves an alternative works. The assumption guiding American escort tactics was simple and deeply ingrained. If the fighters did not engage the enemy, the bombers would die. American fighters had to turn and fight. Anything else felt like abandonment. Speed without aggression was considered useless. Second Lieutenant Robert Bowles didn't believe that. He had studied the numbers. The performance charts in the Mustang's manual were clear. The P-51D he flew could reach speeds of more than 430 miles per hour in level flight at high altitude. The Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters, topped out around 410 miles per hour under similar conditions. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was dangerous in a climb and extremely maneuverable, but in sustained high-altitude level flight it struggled to keep pace with a Mustang running at full power, which meant something very important. In theory, a Mustang didn't have to fight. It just had to be faster. If a pilot refused the engagement and simply accelerated away, many German fighters might never catch him. It sounded simple, but no one had deliberately tested the idea. Not as a tactic, not as doctrine. Bowles began talking about it quietly with other pilots in his squadron. Late evenings in the operations hut or over cups of bitter coffee, he mentioned the idea in careful, half-joking ways. A few pilots listened with curiosity. Others laughed. One of them asked the question everyone was thinking. What happens if you're wrong? The pilot leaned back in his chair and continued. What if you run and they catch you anyway? Now you're alone, out of position, and they've got altitude on you. They bounce you from above and you're dead before you even see them. It was a fair point. Bowles didn't have a perfect answer. Not yet, but he intended to find out. March 19, 1944. The mission was Berlin again. Before dawn, the airfields across eastern England came alive with activity. Hundreds of bombers assembled in the gray morning light, while ground crews hurried between aircraft. Condensation dripped from aluminum wings. Crewmen stamped their boots against the cold. Pilots reviewed maps under dim red lights, while mechanics performed last-minute engine checks. Everything about the process felt routine, until the moment it wasn't. The 357th Fighter Group began launching shortly after 0900 hours. One by one, Mustangs roared down the runway and lifted into the pale sky, climbing to join the bomber stream forming over the coast. Robert Bowles flew wingman for his flight leader, a captain with 2 confirmed kills and a reputation for aggressive flying. The captain was the kind of pilot who believed the best defense was always attack. The briefing had been straightforward. Escort the bombers to the target. Stay close to the formation. Engage enemy fighters when they appear. Bring everyone home. They crossed the English Channel at 25,000 feet. The sky was a pale, endless blue. The North Sea below looked gray and wrinkled, broken by whitecaps. The steady hum of the Merlin engine filled Bowles' cockpit. Inside the Mustang, everything smelled faintly of oil, rubber, and metal warmed by engine heat. The long flight east continued in silence. Then the Dutch coastline appeared beneath them. Moments later the flak started. Black explosions erupted in the sky around the bomber formations, puffs of smoke hanging like dark flowers in the thin air. German anti-aircraft batteries fired carefully calculated barges designed to break the bomber formations apart. The bombers flew straight through it. The fighters weaved slightly to avoid the bursts. No one in Bowles' flight was hit. For a few minutes, it seemed like another ordinary mission. Then the call came over the radio. Bandits high. 11 o'clock. Bowles scanned the sky. He saw them almost immediately. 12 aircraft climbing through the haze. Focke-Wulf 190s, their broad wings unmistakable, perhaps with a few Bf-109s mixed into the formation. They were climbing hard toward the bomber stream, angling for an attack. The flight leader reacted instantly. Brake left. The American fighters peeled away from the bombers and dove toward the Germans. Bowles followed his leader into the dive. Then halfway down something in his mind clicked. The angle of the German climb seemed wrong. Too steep. Too deliberate. They weren't committing fully. They were climbing and watching. Waiting. The thought hit him suddenly. They're baiting us. Bowles didn't know exactly how he knew. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was the countless hours he had spent analyzing the way air combat unfolded. But he trusted the feeling. In a split second, he made a decision that went against every instinct drilled into fighter pilots. He pulled out of the dive. Instead of turning into the fight, he leveled his wings. Then he shoved the throttle all the way forward. War emergency power. The Merlin engine roared. The Mustang surged ahead like a released spring. The airspeed needle began climbing. 350 miles per hour. 370, 400. His flight leader continued diving into the German formation below. Bowles was now alone, and he wasn't turning back. He held the aircraft perfectly level, pushing the engine harder than most pilots dared for sustained flight. The Mustang accelerated. Then he saw them. Another group of fighters. 8 more aircraft, higher and behind the first group, positioned exactly where they would be if the Americans committed to the dive. Waiting. A trap. The German pilots spotted him immediately. They rolled into pursuit. From their perspective, the lone Mustang was an easy kill. They had altitude. They had numbers. And he was flying straight. But the kill never came. Bowles kept the Mustang level and fast. The airspeed passed 420 miles per hour. The aircraft began to tremble slightly in the thin air, buffeting at the edge of its performance envelope. He trimmed the nose down just enough to keep the acceleration smooth. Behind him, the German fighters were still chasing. The Merlin engine howled at full power. The temperature gauges crept closer to the red line. And Robert Bowles did the one thing no Luftwaffe pilot expected. He didn't fight. He just kept getting faster. Robert Bowles glanced briefly at the engine gauges glowing on his instrument panel. The temperature needle had crept past the safe zone and was now pushing into the red. He ignored it. At war emergency power, the Mustang's Merlin engine could deliver incredible speed, but only for a short time. Push it too long and something would fail. Pistons, valves, coolant lines. Engines had been known to seize or explode under that kind of strain. He probably had 5 minutes before something broke. Maybe less, but he didn't need 5 minutes. Behind him, the German fighters opened fire. Streams of tracers streaked across the sky, bright lines cutting through the thin air. Most passed well behind his aircraft, falling short before they could reach him. A few flashed close enough to his wings that he could see the faint glow of burning phosphorus in the rounds. None of them hit, because the German pilots weren't closing the distance. They were falling behind. The FW-190s chasing him were powerful fighters, fast and deadly in combat. But they had been designed for a different style of air war, climbing quickly, rolling sharply, engaging in violent turning battles. The Mustang had been designed for something else. Speed. And right now, speed was everything. The German formation began to stretch out behind him. The faster aircraft pushed ahead in the pursuit while the slower ones drifted backward, unable to keep pace. Their firing angles worsened with every passing second. The gap widened. First 100 yards, then 200, then 500. Bowles glanced into his rearview mirror. The pursuing fighters were still there, but they were shrinking now, becoming smaller shapes against the sky. He kept the throttle pinned forward. The Mustang shuddered as it pushed through the thin air. The entire airframe vibrated under the stress. He could feel the buzz of metal through the control stick, rivets trembling as the aircraft strained at the edge of its limits. The Merlin engine screamed at full power. Oil pressure fluctuated slightly. Engine temperature continued climbing. The machine was giving him everything it had, and it was enough. One by one, the German pilots began to break off the chase. They understood what was happening. They couldn't catch him. Continuing the pursuit meant burning fuel they could not afford to waste, especially deep inside German airspace where the bombers still waited. Bowles watched them peel away. First one, then another, then 3 more. Soon all of them had turned back toward the bomber stream. The sky behind him was empty again. He was alone, but this time he was alive. Slowly he pulled the throttle back and allowed the engine to cool. The Mustang's vibrations eased as the power setting dropped. He watched the temperature gauge carefully until it crept back toward safe levels. Everything was still functioning. Barely. He had burned an enormous amount of fuel escaping the interceptors. The drop tanks were long empty, and his internal tanks were far lower than he liked. But he was still flying, and he was still heading west. Bowles looked around. The sky stretched endlessly in every direction, blue above, thin streaks of contrails fading behind him. There were no friendly aircraft nearby and no enemies in sight. Just the quiet rush of air around the cockpit. He had survived without firing a single shot. And in doing so, he had proven something no one had really believed before. You could outrun them. Bowles landed back at RAF Leiston roughly 90 minutes later. As his Mustang rolled to a stop on the muddy taxiway, his crew chief noticed the engine cowling immediately. The paint around the nose of the aircraft had blistered from the extreme heat. Dark streaks of oil ran along the fuselage. The Merlin engine clicked and pinged loudly as it cooled, metal contracting after the brutal strain. Bowles climbed out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands trembled slightly as the adrenaline drained from his body. He walked straight to the operations hut for the post-mission debrief. Inside, the intelligence officer listened while Bowles described what had happened. 12 German interceptors. The dive. The decision to break off. The chase. The escape. The officer wrote everything down in a calm, steady script. No judgment. No commentary. Just facts. But stories spread quickly among fighter pilots. By that evening, half the group had already heard the story. A young lieutenant had outrun 12 German fighters. He hadn't fired his guns. He hadn't turned to fight. He had simply pushed the throttle forward and disappeared. Some pilots believed it had been pure luck. Others thought it was brilliant. A few quietly muttered that running from a fight sounded like cowardice. Bowles didn't care what they thought. He knew what had happened. More importantly, he knew something else. It could be done again. Within 2 weeks, other pilots in the 357th Fighter Group began experimenting with the same tactic. Not as a primary strategy, but as an option. When a pilot found himself alone. When fuel was low. When enemy numbers were overwhelming. Instead of turning into the fight, some simply accelerated away. Throttle forward. Level flight. Maximum speed. And again, it worked. German pilots soon noticed the change. Luftwaffe radio transcripts from April and May 1944 began mentioning American fighters that refused to engage. Mustangs that simply accelerated and vanished before interceptors could close the distance. The tactic slowly spread beyond the 357th. Other fighter groups heard about it. Briefing officers began mentioning it casually during mission planning. Not as official doctrine, just common sense. If you can't win the fight, don't take it. Use your speed. Live to fight another day. The effect was subtle but measurable. During the spring of 1944, fighter losses in the 8th Air Force began to decline slightly. Pilots were becoming more experienced, tactics were improving, and aircraft performance continued to evolve. But part of the change came from something simpler. More pilots were refusing unnecessary fights, and more of them were coming home. Robert Bowles finished the war with 73 combat missions. Official records credit him with 2 aerial victories, both in situations where he had no choice but to engage the enemy. But numbers never told the full story. His real victories were harder to measure. They were counted in missions where he survived, in wingmen who followed his example and returned safely, in gallons of fuel not wasted in pointless dogfights, in pilots who chose survival over pride. When the war ended, Bowles returned to Iowa. He went back to farming. Like many veterans of that generation, he didn't speak much about what he had done. When people asked about the war, he shrugged and said he had flown fighters, and that he had been lucky. But luck wasn't the right word. What Robert Bowles had done wasn't luck. It was observation, logic, and the willingness to trust an idea that no one else had yet tested. The doctrine said to fight. The doctrine cost lives. So he questioned it. He had no authority, no high rank, no permission. He just had a throttle and the courage to push it forward. In 1983, a military historian tracked him down for an oral history interview. By then, Bowles was in his 60s, still quiet and thoughtful. The historian asked him about the mission, the 12 German fighters, and the decision to run. Bowles thought about it for a moment before answering. He said he hadn't been trying to be clever. He just didn't see the point in dying when the airplane could go faster. Then he added something even simpler. The P-51 could outrun them. So I let it. The historian asked if he had been afraid. Bowles nodded. He said he had been terrified. But fear, he explained, didn't mean you stopped thinking. Robert Bowles died in 1996. His obituary appeared in a small local newspaper in Iowa. It mentioned his military service, his family, and the farm where he had spent most of his life. It did not mention the day he outran 12 German fighters high above Germany. But the lesson he demonstrated never disappeared. Every fighter pilot since has learned it in one form or another. Survival can be a tactic. Discretion is not cowardice. And sometimes the smartest way to win a dogfight is to refuse the fight entirely. Robert Bowles didn't chase glory. He chased the horizon. And in doing so, he gave others the chance to do the same.